Hi everybody, welcome. Today we're going to take a look at some of your first assignments and discuss some of the things that you did correctly and some of the things that we could refine or revisit and perhaps make some adjustments in the image. So just to refresh your memory here, we are doing one image where the motion is frozen. And one of the key things about freezing up that motion is that we kind of get that frozen action in what we like to call as photographers the decisive moment, where that action sort of meets it or reaches its pinnacle. And then our second image is going to be a blurred image where we've got a slow shutter being used to make motion look very fluid or active. So with that being said, let's take a look at some of the images here. So first up, we have Bonnie's work, and this is her first image. Really good frozen image in terms of technique, because if we look at the dog's feet, which when we're looking at frozen images, we always kind of look at limbs and extremities, because if you think about it, those are the parts that are really going to be moving the fastest, whereas the dog's torso really isn't going to be moving super fast. And here's one of our little things here in Photoshop. We can just go under File, File Info, and we can actually take a look at some of that data that came through in your camera, and we can see the settings here. An exposure of 1,000th of a second. Yeah, that's absolutely perfect. F-stop of 5. Absolutely. An ISO of 8. That's fantastic. All settings that I think are really appropriate for this type of image here. So great job with that. Compositionally, let's talk about this image just a little bit here. I'm just going to throw in a little crop tool here just so we can see these grid lines. On the grid lines, we can see these four spots where they intersect here. You guys will hear down the road in this course the rule of thirds. But generally speaking, the rule of thirds suggests that if we put our subject in one of these four spots, that it's going to add a little bit of visual interest to the photograph. So again, we can kind of see that Bonnie did put the dog in that spot, and we've got lots of great negative space here, or empty space. Negative actually isn't a negative term in compositional language. So I like that. The thing that I probably would say to myself is we do have a lot of emptiness in the background, or I shouldn't say emptiness, things that aren't important to what's going on in the photograph. And for me, it's actually a teeny bit distracting. And here's why. Our eye goes to the brightest spot in a photograph. So this is just kind of like an unconscious, natural thing that our eye is going to do in photographs. And kind of my eye is going right to this spot and this spot here. All these little specular highlights in the water, as opposed to going to the dog. I really almost, find myself hunting for the dog around this frame. So I think that, perhaps maybe a better approach to this image, especially even if you want to kind of keep that same compositional technique, is really crop in a little bit and try and eliminate as much of this stuff going on in the background here. I'm going to do just a quick adjustment here to darken up this background. And even with this adjustment here, it does kind of look like that background is still a little bit bright. But I think you can see now how our eye's just a little bit more attracted to the dog there as opposed to the background. Now, from a technical perspective again, and even from the decisive moment, I think it's cool because you've got the dog sort of at the peak of the turn there, and his ears are sort of up in the air, and it's there's the legs are up. So I think it's really solid photograph. Just I think you're doing something that a lot of people do early on in photography is just they try to include too much rather than simplifying things. So just tighten that frame up and simplify a little bit here. Your second image is your blur. Honestly, yeah, you got the blur here for sure. No questions about that. You are going at one full second. But here's the problem. Had I not seen this photograph first, if you had just presented me with this photograph, I probably would have no idea what that is. And if I really kind of stared and looked at it, I probably eventually could have figured out that it was a dog. But I think blurring, the trick is finding that spot where the subject is still recognizable, but a little bit blurred. And in this instance, you were at 1 second. I probably would have gone to a quarter of a second rather than 1 full second. A quarter of a second, or maybe even an eighth of a second, probably gets you that dog being blurred, but he's going to look more like something that's in motion rather than this kind of just blurry blob of I guess almost ghostiness there. And then the hydrangea blur looks like you use the zoom on your camera to either zoom in or zoom out while the shutter was open during that long exposure. And so you were at 1/6 of a second on this image. Great on that. And again, I like this because we kind of do eventually figure out here that it's flowers when we look through the frame. So I think that works. And honestly, I think this is a little bit more of a creative, thoughtful approach to the blur photograph rather than just having someone or something just go out and run around and blur it. I like the fact that you're kind of thinking through this and trying to do something a little bit different with that technique, which certainly works for me. So overall, good job. Just a little issue on the dog blur, but certainly that is something that you really just have to play around with for every single subject. So maybe on this dog it's going to work at 1/8 of a second, but then you may find you have a little kid riding on a bicycle and it's a totally different setting. It's really just it relative to how fast your subject is moving, and obviously every single subject is going to move differently. So next up we have Alvin's work, and Alvin, I just want to show you this. Your file you submitted here is an RTF file, which is looks like some sort of compressed document file. You need to submit JPEGs for the assignment, so please make sure that you read the instructions really carefully and submit what we're looking for here. If you see I double click on this, it looks like it's going to give me a pages document, and then in that pages document I don't see anything other than your written reflection, which certainly is very relevant, but I don't see any image in here that we can evaluate. So please, again, make sure that you go ahead and submit JPEGs for us for your pictures. Okay, next up we have Leah's images, and we'll start off with her frozen image. Looks like we've got her teammate doing, or friend, a fine example of the dab. And let's look at the info here. Shooting at 1/4000th of a second. Absolutely, I love that. F-stop 7.1, that's good too. But ooh, wait a minute here. ISO 6400. That is probably, not probably, it is not an ideal ISO setting for us. We want to bring this ISO setting down, probably 1600 at the highest, because we're in a really bright area here, so we really don't need to do this. So we could bring this exposure time down to, if we half this, it's 1/4000th. I'm sorry, it's 1/2000th, and we half that again, it's 1/1000th. So then we just do this, halving again. So half 1/6400 is 3200, and then halving that again is 1600. So that would give us the same exposure, but if we zoom in here, you're going to see what's happening with the 6400. It's giving you all this like really wicked graininess in there. So we really want to just stick to those really high ISOs, in situations where the lighting is really dark, or you really kind of have to push the envelope in terms of your shutter and get a fast shutter speed, which really in this situation you don't, because you've got a lot of light going on here. It looks like it's a pretty brightly lit day. So one other thing that just compositionally you talk about here, you got the decisive moment absolutely wonderful. I mean, this is, I think, everybody a great example of the decisive moment. She's up in the air, she's got her feet lifted off the ground, the arms are in the perfect position. All of that works. What doesn't work for me though is sort of this really busy background, from the griffin statue here to the cars to the light to really the brightness back here. And again, as I said with Bonnie's images, our eye does really go to the brightest part of a frame, and my eye is really attracted up here, not down here. And this is what's really most interesting for me. I think in this situation, maybe the better approach would have been to just turn around completely and use Science Hall as the background. I think that would have been a little bit cleaner, less distracting palette behind your frozen shot. And then your blur image here, looks like we've got your geraniums blowing in the wind here. And if we go to the shutter settings, like that exposure, perfect, 1/12 of a second, f14, ISO 100, awesome. And if we zoom in here too, the image is blurred, so it's not going to be a perfect example, but we can see like all that graininess that was in the 6400 ISO shot, the previous one. We don't see that here. Just notice how smooth and clean this red is, as opposed to, we go in here and we get tight in here. Notice like all your color isn't smooth. It's actually kind of like speckled and dotted, and that speckling or dotting that we see all throughout here, in the greens, that's called noise, digital noise. Sometimes in the old days of photography, we used to refer to that as graininess. It's kind of the same thing, but just kind of the digital version of it. So great job with this. Perfect ISO settings here. I like the demonstration of technique here with the motion with the flowers. I'm not sure we're going to hang this up in the Wall of Fame for photographs. Again, a lot of distracting elements in the background. I think, we want to simplify things. And, for me, maybe it's just kind of this right here, just all the burst of color in the flowers as opposed to anything else. So, maybe even a little bit of abstraction there kind of works for me on that photo. So good job with that. Just, I think, in terms of subject matter here, I'm not sure this is the best thing, but at this point right now we're really just trying to hammer out those technical issues, which it looks like you did pretty nicely on this shot. So keep up the good work. And so next up we have Brett's images, and our first shot. The picture looks pretty frozen up. I think, if you remember Bonnie's review, I talked about looking at the extremities of people, and that's where they move the fast, and we can kind of see, on his foot here with the back kick, I guess, from the pitching delivery. You can see we do have a little bit of motion there, so it's not perfectly frozen up. I think we look at his face and the glove areas and stuff like that, looks pretty good, but down here it still does look a little bit blurry. So let's take a look at your settings here. Camera data, I don't have any settings right there. Let's pause this a half a sec. Okay, so just looking back at your reflections, you are at 1/400th of a second. So in this instance, you're a little bit on the slow side. And I have to tell you that just from having shot a lot of baseball in my life, that you really want to have a picture somewhere between 1/1000th of a second and 1/2000th of a second. That is, generally speaking, going to freeze everything up in there. And if you want to start freezing up a baseball in midair, you probably have to go to all the way up to 1/4000th of a second. So certainly that is kind of the really good spot you want to be in for that type of image. You're getting there, and 1/400th of a second on maybe a small kid pitching would work here, but 1/400th is just a teeny bit on the slow side on this one. For everybody else's reference here, I do like the fact that it's a really clean frame. That you don't have the busyness, the distractions of some of the other stuff. I guess the one thing I might crop out is looks like there was a runner on third base here, so maybe we just crop in a teeny little bit on that image. And then the blur shot, it looks like you did a nice job here. Again, we're seeing that nice blur in all of the extremities here, and it's funny, the plant foot, which kind of almost remains stationary, is still there. Now, obviously, you can play around with this a little bit if you want to go ahead and do a little bit longer. You're gonna, get more of the blurring in that motion, or even if you go a teeny bit shorter on this, you may end up getting even. So, you were at 1/4 of a second in this image. And then maybe if you went to a 1/2 a second, it might look a little bit different. But again, with these blurs, it's really just a matter of kind of playing around and finding the spot that really works the best for you here. So, good job on this one. I think in both instances, you're generally speaking in the area you need to be. Technically speaking, I'd certainly like to see this one frozen up a teeny bit better, but certainly 1/400th is a setting that's going to freeze up most things, but certainly not a baseball pitcher, and especially an adult one that is really delivering the ball pretty fast. So you're almost there. I think you got a general understanding of it. It's maybe just a little bit of refining and tweaking this. So keep working at it. And last but not least, here we have Andia's images. So first up, we've got the blur shot, and go to our file info and camera data, 1/125th of a second. So this is a really good example here, because this is definitely frozen up. That dog is certainly frozen, but the dog's probably walking pretty slowly. So we saw in Bonnie's image, dog that was moving really fast. It looked like that dog was running around at top speed, and it took 1/1000th of a second to freeze that up, or 2/1000th of a second. Whereas in this instance, dog's walking pretty slow here, and 1/125th of a second does its job. So that is definitely frozen up. I guess the one thing I would say here, and it's just kind of going to be a continuing theme with me, and this is pretty normal for you guys for your first assignments, you got to tighten things up here. There's just like a lot of empty space here that is not adding to the photo. So maybe something like that is just a little bit more tightened up and focused in on your central characters in this. So good job otherwise. Really nice job with this. And then your blurred shot, look at this, you're at 1/8 of a second. Again, that's really good. That's where you should be. We can see that this is clearly a dog, and a dog running. I guess the only thing I would say here is that it's the dog itself. I mean, maybe get it jumping or doing some sort of activity, I think might add a little bit of visual interest to this photograph. And then the other thing, you again have sort of like all this brightness over here, which I think is just really distracting and draws our eye away from the primary subject in the frame. So certainly, whoops, back here. certainly, tightening up like that is the way ideally I'd like you to go on that. So that is going to wrap things up for all of us on our first assignment here. Just keep in mind that with all these technical things, you got to practice it a lot. Be very aware of the images you're shooting, and it's also helpful to even bring along a little notebook with you and write down those settings as you take a photograph, so you start to develop a habit and an understanding of what each one of these different shutter settings does. So ultimately you want to be able to master these and be able to set them up without even thinking about them that much. It should almost become second nature to you. So that'll wrap us up here. Keep practicing, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks.